Hey book friends, welcome back to the channel. So you guys, I've been on BookTube like 4 years now and I've yet to make this video. It's a really popular video, but it's also I think really challenging to make. It's the if you like this book, try this book recommendation type video, but yet I decided to put one together and it's all because of this book. So I read recently The Women by Kristin Hannah and I loved it. But the thing is I have a book that reminded me of this book, and I don't think I've ever talked about it on this channel. So stay tuned as I give you the recommendation for this book, as well as I think like 8 other book recommendations. So hi, my name is Angie. Welcome to the channel. Welcome back to the channel, all the things. So like I said, I am making a if you like this book, try this book recommendation video. And I was going to split this out by genre, but I just decided to throw them all into this video. I'm going to give you my book recommendation for The Women, but I'm going to do that at the end, only because I really want you to hear some of my other recommendations. I think there's some good ones. So let's just start with my first recommendation. So my first recommendation is If You Liked The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gornichek. If you liked this book, I think you should try this book. So it's Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. So the reason I picked these two books is for the purpose of kind of that lone, strong woman vibe. And so in Witch's Heart, which was one of my favorites of last year, it's a bit of a mythology retelling of the woman of Agrabota who was the wife to Loki. She's the central character as he comes in and out of her life, as she bears children for him and things like that. But yet she has to deal with so much, and not just from Loki, but in general from kind of the Norse gods, and how there's just kind of an inner strength within her. When I was thinking about kind of her character, it really reminded me of this book, which it's been a while since I've read this book. I read this in like 2020 or something like that. Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. It is a historical fiction book about the last woman executed in Iceland. So it is about a woman named Agnes who has been charged with murdering 2 men. And then this book follows kind of as she's waiting for her execution, if you will. So she has been sent to this kind of remote farm, and like the police have asked this couple who owns this farm to kind of house her until her execution. And you get to know her and you feel like you're trying to get a bit of her story. You're asking yourself the whole time, did she do this? But you're getting it from her point of view, and she just has this kind of inner strength, an inner resolve, even though life has been hard and hard things have been kind of handed to her. How does she respond? And it's just reminded me of Agrabota. And so I highly recommend this. This is definitely a beautifully written, thought-provoking story about kind of a woman as she's contemplating her life, as she's potentially contemplating her death. So it's really, really good. Okay, so my next recommendation has to do with this book by Riley Sager. So it's The Last Time I Lied. And now my recommendation for this is Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson. I'll pop up a picture here because I never did purchase these. I got them from the library. I think these 2 books have a lot in common. First off, Truly Devious, I believe, is YA. I'm not sure if you would say this is YA per se, but what I think they have in common is the vibe. So in this book, it's about a woman who is returning to a summer camp she went to as like a teenager when some strange things happened. Like she had these bunkmates and they went missing and were never found, and she has some secrets involved in that, and so it very much has that summer camp setting. And then as you're talking Truly Devious, that doesn't have summer camp setting, but it has like mountain elite school setting, which I think is just very unique, but it ends up with some similar scenes, or at least the setting is similar. Like they're out kind of in the middle of nowhere, some creepy things are happening, and I loved that. The other thing that's kind of in common between these 2 books is kind of that mystery in the past. Like they're both trying to solve that. So I realized I didn't say what Truly Devious is about. It's about a girl named Stevie, if I remember right. And she has been accepted into this school under the pretenses that she has claimed that she can solve the long lost mystery of what happened to the founder's wife and child, that they were kidnapped or killed or something like that. And it has been unsolved ever since. And she's claiming that she can solve it. So it's kind of this going back in the past and solving a mystery. So they both have very similar vibes, but yet they're not the same, which is what I was going for, because I didn't want to just give you another summer camp book. But I think if you liked this one, that one will be a big hit for you as well. Okay, the next pairing. You just kind of have to trust me on this one because I really wanted to include this book because it's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorite books. I really need to reread it. It's The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. Now, this book is super twisty. It's got a very non-linear timeline, and that is important for this story because it is telling the story of this man who has been tasked to go to this manor house of this woman who is about to die. But the key is that he is going to relive the day over and over, kind of like Groundhog's Day, but he's going to relive it from a different perspective of like a different guest at that party to try and put it all together. And it starts in different places and you get different bits of information, which I think is the important part of why I'm comparing it to this book, Ona Out of Order. And this is by Margarita Montemor. So these are very different, right? It's like historical fantasy sci-fi with all that kind of Groundhog's Day stuff. And then this is very much like a contemporary time travel book. So that's kind of what drew me in, because this isn't necessarily time travel, it's messing with time, right? And so there's some similarities there if you like that messing with time trope. This one has more to do with time travel of like living snippets of her life in different orders. So it's basically about this woman who wakes up after New Year's Eve and she is in a different time, but still herself. So she's like an older version of herself. And then the next year, come New Year's Eve, the next morning she will wake up in a different time. So she might be 53 and then she'll be 32 and then she'll be 14 and then she'll be 72. You know what I mean? I think it's a really fascinating portrayal of life and understanding your life in the perspective of time. But also there was a lot of mysteries where you're trying to piece it together. And it just really did remind me of this in that sense. They have different feels. So this is not the same vibe by any means. It's a very different vibe, but it has those elements which I feel like if you liked over here, you'll probably like here, and vice versa. But if you have read either or both of these books, let me know if you agree with that pairing, because I think it's kind of clever, but you all might think I'm crazy. Okay, the next one is a little bit more straightforward. Now this is another favorite of mine. So The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I mean, this book is coined as kind of the first dark academia type book where there's this group of students in the philosophy department and they are studying under the best professor at like Oxford or someplace. And they're very pretentious. And in this case, there is a murder of one of them. You know one of them dies. You even know who it is on the first page. You watch it as that person does die, and then the aftermath of that and everything is just kind of intense, if you will. So I really enjoyed this. It is very pretentious. That is kind of what drew me to this book as well. So this is The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. Now this also has a dark academia feel to it, school setting, pretentious students, which is really kind of those things pull it together, but it's different in a lot of ways as well. As where this is a story set in the real world, this is like a magical world. This is set at the School of Alexandria, where these 6 students are personally invited to join the school for a couple years. There's a catch though that one of their numbers won't make it into that second year and they don't quite know how they'll be competing for their spot. But you still have some really interesting characters, some really just full of themselves characters. Now there's some that aren't as much, and that's the same for this book. But I just feel like that aspect is in both, and so if you like that part of this book, read this, or vice versa, like I've said already. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about might also feel like a bit of a stretch for some of you, but I loved both of these books and there's a tie here. So the first one is Once and Future Witches. This is by Alex E. Harrow. I really enjoyed this book. This has to do with, well, witches, but sisters. Sisters who have been kind of separated after childhood, who are brought back together. One, to kind of heal their relationship, but also to kind of face a big bad thing, but also kind of like society at large. Like it is during, what time frame? 1893. So you're talking a time when women don't have very many rights. And there actually is a bit of a subplot of like women's suffrage and rights in this book as well. So it's kind of like women fighting against men to have equal footing, right? But then there's also kind of this sisterhood to them. So because of those reasons, I would recommend The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes. So this book is totally different. There's no witches involved in this book, so that's not the commonality. The commonality is a strong set of women. In this case, they're not sisters. I'll tell you what it's about in just a second. They're not sisters, but they are also fighting against a time in life when men don't believe women have much to give, right? And so in this case, they are part of the traveling library. Is it in Kentucky? In Kentucky, and you're following a number of different women in their point of view as they struggle to help these poor individuals in the mountains of Kentucky, to bring them books and to bring them knowledge and help, really. And there's some pushback by some of the men in this story, and so they just really band together in this tight group of women, and it's so good. I love both of these books. All right, my next recommendation is of two books that I have read recently, but man, they seem so similar. So I read The Collected Regrets of Clover by Miki Brammer, and this is about Clover, who is a death doula, who is just kind of facing some things in her life, and those things kind of push her out of her comfort zone and help her grow. Now, I would recommend The Maid by Nita Prose. Now this is actually more of a cozy mystery, as where this is straight up contemporary, not mystery, but this is, and this has to do with Molly, who works as a maid at the Regency Grand Hotel, and she has recently lost her grandma, and her grandma was the person who kind of grounded her in the world because she has some neurodivergent tendencies, and so when there's a murder at the hotel, she kind of gets wrapped into it just because of how she responds to some situations. And so the connection I would draw between these two is their personalities and how they see the world. Like, they feel like misunderstood outcasts, and they're just not sure how to form solid relationships with others, how to connect at a deeper level, and so they feel kind of like they are alienated or lonely, but yet in both these stories they grow and are challenged, and they're just, it's beautiful in that kind of messaging. So I think these two are very similar. So I'm almost done. This is my last recommendation before the women, and so I have one that is more of a series. So I have, if you liked the Daevabad trilogy by S.A. Chakraborty, starting with The City of Brass, you would probably like the Rook and the Rose series. So this is the first one, The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. Now, the reason I would say these are similar, because on the outset you would be like, those are so different. And they are, but I feel like how the world is set up and how kind of the social structures are set up is very similar. And so this is about a girl named Nari who is in ancient day Cairo, and she summons a jinn warrior, and then he realizes she has some giftings, and he takes her to the City of Magic, which is the City of Brass, and the plot goes from there, right? But the important part is that when they get to the city is divided in, like, there are these upper class or elites, and then there are this group of people who are looked down upon, and they are very much trampled upon, so much so that there is a subplot of kind of revolt, and there's a subplot of like rising up against your oppressors, right? Same here. And even though this is about our main character of Ren, who is a con artist who comes into the town of Nadezra, and she is wanting to kind of con the elite, the Leganti, who are just the people who are ruling the city. They are the people who have kind of all the power, the nice houses, all these things. But then there's the other set of people who are being pushed down by this ruling class. Even though they might have been there first, this other group came in and fought for control, and now they have control and they are oppressing this group of people. And again, it has a lot of those undertones in this book. And so I just feel like if you liked that aspect of this, you would love that aspect of this one. And they're both, in my opinion, very character-driven series. They're both ones that you have to love the characters to really get into the world. And I almost recommended this one as well because this has a very similar, like, elite houses and people who are oppressing the lower class, or I think it was the ska in this. But this is a little different because there is also this kind of lord ruler who is oppressing everybody. So it's a little different, but it's kind of along the same vein, and I just love Mistborn, the first Mistborn series, this first book being The Final Empire, which has kind of a heist story, and it's just so good. So I mean, I would loosely put that in, if you liked any of those books, those all kind of go together, and that's also, in my opinion, pretty character driven. But as for the book that inspired this video, The Women by Kristin Hannah, which is about a combat nurse who goes to Vietnam. Half the book is spent really in her time in Vietnam, her time dealing with the war and the soldiers being brought to her and the kinds of emergencies and the kinds of horrors she witnessed, right? That is the first part. The second part is her coming back into the US and kind of re-entry of the soldiers into society. And I just loved it. I will link my latest wrap up in case you want to hear kind of more thoughts on this book for me. But I would recommend The Fire by Night by Teresa Mazzano, I believe. I'll put the picture up here. Now this book, okay, this is again a book set at war from the perspective of the nurses. This is a World War II book. It follows two friends who decide to enlist together. And it kind of has that same feel as our main character, Frankie here, who kind of feels like she wants to like support and honor her country, right? And they do the same thing. They go to basic training together and then they get shipped off, but they get shipped off to different parts of the war. One of them ends up in the Pacific and one of them ends up in kind of Europe somewhere. And you're also following their journeys, like the idea that, oh, you're not going to be close to the front lines, and then something's happened and they're kind of more close to the front lines, and then you have to deal with the soldiers that come in and the doctors, and it is more similar to the first part of this book, I would say, and just the hardships as the war went on. So there really isn't a re-entry aspect to that story, or at least not a very large aspect to the book. It is really more centered on being a combat nurse, but in this case in World War II. So if you are coming off of The Women, if you've recently read it and you just loved it, try this book. It is definitely like 5 years old or something like that, but it is so good. It is just not talked about. I feel like it's a really interesting one. So if you do end up picking that up, let me know, because I would love to hear your thoughts on it, because nobody ever talks about it. But anyway, those are my books for if you like this book, try this book type video. Let me know what you think about my comparisons, if they made sense, or if you're like, no. And let me know if you have any other good ones, like especially for the books I talked about. So say it's like the Devious series or the Maid or anything like that. If you have other books that you think would pair up well with the books I chatted about, let me know down below. But if you made it to the end of the video and you can't think of anything to say, let's just leave me an emoji. I think let's do a little fire for like Fire by Night. But that's what I have for the video. If you liked it, of course, thumbs up, subscribe if you want to, all the things. You guys, I will see you in my next book video. All right, take care.